Hi, Rocky Road family. We're back again this week with a new guest. Her name is Lee, and we're really excited to meet and talk with her. She has a great knowledge of a lot of things that we do bring up here on the Rocky Road podcast. So, Lee, thanks so much for joining us. We're glad that you're here with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honor, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world or whenever you happen to be watching us.
So tell us about yourself. If somebody says, who is Lee, what would you say?
Who is Lee? Lee is a complex person. Gosh, how do you put all that together, right? In just a few sentences. Complex in that, gosh, I'm old, I'm gray. So you know that I've gone through lots of years and lots of stuff in my journey. Professionally, I'm an end of life grief and resilience coach, along with my business partner, Shadow. And I'll maybe mention something about Shadow along the way as we talk about grief. Personally, I am a grandmother of a 2-year-old who I absolutely adore. He is so much fun. I live in Massachusetts, in New England, USA. Um, I love the outdoors. I love my family. I love my pets who are my family. And my work is not work for me. It's my passion. It's my ministry. And I consider myself super fortunate because I get to go to work.
That's a huge thing, and especially at end of life and in hospice and in grief, because in my work, I've had a couple of a smattering, I'll say, of end of life. Sometimes we didn't know it was end of life and grief based services. And even just that experience has told me there's no way that I could go into it full time because I don't think I have the emotional capacity to process it appropriately on a daily basis. Whereas Mandy has had experience in hospice and just knowing that work, it 100% is a calling. And I have such respect for anyone who not only chooses to do this every single day, but is able to continue. You have a long career in doing it as well. And so there's sustainability in what you do.
You know what? My analogy is a class 5 whitewater river. So think of that. If you've ever gone whitewater rafting, you'll know what I'm talking about. But even just imagine those whitewaters in your mind, and you're at the very beginning of it, and you're in this raft that's supposed to hold you up, and there you go. You're launched into this crazy wild river that you have no idea when the twists or turns are coming. When's a boulder going to pop up in front of you and you got to try and navigate around it, or the branch that you suddenly have to duck under. And you don't know when it's going to be crazier or when it's going to slow down, or, oh, here's a quiet part. How long do I have this quiet before it gets insane again? It's all over the map. There's no timeline. You know, what works for you isn't going to work for the person over here. I think there's a great image called the ball of grief. It's just a ball with all these chaotic pieces inside with a bunch of different feelings named. And just like the ball where they're all interwoven and twisted, that's how our feelings are.
And it all depends on the context and the way the wind blows and the amount of rain. Speaking of the river analogy, you could go down the same, quote, same river on a different day with a different pack, with a different mindset, and have a completely different experience.
I love that. Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
What do you say to people that have emotions that they don't think that they're going to have in their immediate grief? People that have a sense of relief, or people that feel guilty immediately, or people that may be happy that somebody died if they were suffering and they're happy. And then all of a sudden they have this jolt of happiness that they're like, wait, what? Or caregivers, like a sense of freedom for them that
Mhm.
have been providing care for maybe a decade or more. And they finally now can go out to dinner the next night. And having that sense, what do you say to people that go through that?
I try and let them know ahead of time
Mm-hmm.
that's going to happen. I love when I have the opportunity to have a continuum when I work with a client at end of life and have met their family and
Mm-hmm.
talked about some of these. Here's what you might expect. When mom dies, uh, you've been watching her for 5 years go through this struggle. You're going to miss her, but be aware that you might also feel a sense of relief, and that's okay.
Mm,
Mm-hmm.
So it's naming it. It's um, val- validating it
Mm-hmm.
and normalizing it.
mhm.
Yeah.
Validation was the word that was coming to mind when you were speaking just now, because being able to say, here's your menu of emotions that you may or may not be experiencing, and they're all okay.
Yep.
Whereas so many of us say, I'm supposed to feel a certain way. But even
Right.
prefacing it so that when it does come upon them, and then when they do experience that, they're already like, oh wait, Lee said this was normal and this was normal, right? And Lee said this was okay. So I
Right.
feel less guilty. I feel less shameful. I feel less frustrated with whatever it is that I'm going through.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was looking at your blog a little bit in prep, and I noticed that there's a couple of different. It's beautiful layout, by the way. Just I love the
Oh,
pictures. So go check out Lee's blog. We're gonna link it and everything. It also talks multiple times about why pets are so important, and I agree. But there was a couple of articles on why it's so important to address grief first and address it when it's happening
Mhm.
and not prolong it. Can you share with me a little bit about and share with our listeners about why it's so important to address it head on when it's happening?
Yeah. Because grief isn't something that can be avoided. Uh, if we try and ignore it, if we try and pretend that, oh, I'm doing fine, and we stuff it,
Mm,
it
mm,
comes back to bite us at some point. And
mhm,
often when we're least prepared and least expecting it.
Mm-hmm.
mhm.
Um,
True.
Yeah, it rises up, it bubbles up, and then spews
exactly.
out. And unprocessed grief is worse the longer it goes unprocessed.
That's right.
Mm,
Right.
In the perspective. Um,
mm.
when you are addressing it head on, what are some of the things that you can say to somebody?
The things that you can say, I'm here for you. I'm happy to listen to share your story. Uh, Inviting people to share their story, I think, is one of the more helpful things. People want to talk about their loved one. They want to talk
Mm-hmm.
about what was it like the last time I saw her or him. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and often we don't have a place to share those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what was the one that just went through my head? I don't know, came and went. Just letting people know you're there for them. Things that you can say, not how can I help you, but
Mm,
think a little bit more deeply about that. You, if you're there talking to someone who's grieving, chances are you know them a bit.
mm,
What can you do for them? Oh gosh, this is such a hard time for you, and you've got so much going on. How about if I come over tomorrow and take the kids to the playground for you?
Mm-hmm.
mm,
Right? Give the
mhm.
specific that people can say, "Oh yes, right,
And not even really giving an option too.
yeah."
Yeah, I talk about like I have some young moms in my life. Mandy's heard this story a couple times before, but I'll just say, "Hey, I'm going to the grocery store. Give me 5 things I can get you.
Yep.
Like, do you need X, Y, and Z?" And they say, "Yes, thank you." Or just like something as simple as we had someone who we spoke with who lost their father suddenly to suicide,
Mm,
and they said that someone just brought a puppy over. Like, didn't just say, "Hey, I'm going to bring my puppy over to hang out with you," and then just get to play with a puppy.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And even just something like cutting their grass, if it's
Yep.
something that's an everyday thing that they may not need to think about, because asking somebody, what can I do for you? They've maybe never been through this process before. Obviously, if you lose one parent, you lose another parent. You've kind of have been through it, maybe a little bit different because it's a different
Mm,
relationship. But even traumatic things, people don't know what they need. You
mhm.
don't. You don't grow up
Mm,
coming with a toolbox kit of, "Oh, this is what's gonna happen if
Right.
X, Y, and Z happens," and then it's just this traumatic event that you're trying to process, and you're in a state of shock for a
mm,
week, month,
For who
6
knows
months,
how
whatever it
long,
is.
right?
Like, what do you know you need at that time?
Yeah, yeah. And
Um,
you bring up another good point that a state of shock can be a week, a month, 6 months,
mm,
who knows how long, and people get a lot of support right away. What
mhm, yeah,
happens when all the
yes.
friends and family go back to work and go back to their homes?
Mhm,
That's a good
mm,
time to reach out.
mhm.
mhm,
So my sister, a little bit of disclosure as well. My sister lost her fiance suddenly. She said exactly that same thing was, and there's been a lot of loss in my family, but just that
mhm,
exact same thing where she said there was a show, and I'll share it, but I cannot remember exactly what it's called. But it's with one of the Olsen sisters, one of the older ones, and she said it's just like that, where she was explaining everyone tries to help you for the first couple of months, and then it's quiet, and then it disappears. And my sister said the same thing. She goes, it's exactly how it went. It's everyone wanted to be so supportive, and then the school year started again, and she's a teacher, and then she went to a new school to teach,
Oh,
and then everybody just knew that this was the girl who lost her fiance last summer, and that's all that they knew about this new teacher. And
oh,
it's just being able to support in the long term as well, and being less overwhelmed by it right in the initial, but
yeah,
being able, it's such a longer experience. It's one of Mandy's things that she says, which I absolutely agree with, is grief is chronic.
mhm.
mhm,
It will never go away.
Never. It never goes away.
Mhm.
And ask, for your sister. I imagine if those new teachers, most people would say, "Oh, don't talk about it," just
Mhm.
mhm, yeah,
but,
Yep.
"Oh, tell me about your fiance,"
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, it was worse, she said, because people knew that about her. She knew that they knew it, but nobody talked about it at all.
mhm,
So, yeah, it's just having that experience, and knowing that people are saying things like, "Oh, that's the widow," or "Oh, that's the kid who just lost his father," and just being
Mhm.
open to people, and instead of talking about them, talk with them. It's so
Yeah.
much more empowering for them.
Yes. And don't forget that the person or pet or whatever that died has a name and will
Mm,
always have a name.
mhm,
That's another
mhm,
piece that a lot of people mention is it's as if my husband never existed. People won't use his name,
mm,
mhm.
right?
Sure.
mm,
And I think a lot of people, in this day right now are grieving so much. I was just thinking the other day, about how much we're all still kind of grieving and getting over this whole COVID
Mhm,
season that
mhm,
seemed to have just disappeared now, but was so heavy and so rampant for a year and a half or so. And, um, coming out of these seasons like this, how would you even be able to identify, like, what are some triggers or what are some pinpoint things that you identify in your life that maybe aren't related to a person specifically, but to an experience or to a loss of a part of your life, that may be a loss of, a loved one during COVID, but it could have also just been loss of a job or loss of a business or something major. What are some of those identifying pieces that people can start to see or feel within themselves that they can identify this is grief?
Hmm. Going back to when we stuff grief, it comes back to bite us.
Mhm,
mm,
When you're reacting to something um, more than you might have before, and you sort of
mm,
like, why am I that upset? Why am I so angry?
mhm,
Uh, Take a minute and look back and say, what did this trigger? Right? Because there's so
mm,
much we lost during COVID.
mhm,
There's not one of us who didn't lose something along the
mhm,
way. And a lot of those losses are things that we haven't recognized and acknowledged.
mhm,
mhm,
Right? The loss of freedom. What was it
mhm,
like? How did it affect you to be stuck at home for
mhm,
however many months it was that we were isolated?
mhm,
Um, what what has it done? So one of the things I think about is we all were so isolated, and a lot of people, that became more the norm,
Mhm.
to be alone, to push people away, to keep our distance.
Mhm.
Mm,
And it can be scary going back to that.
Mhm.
People are
mm,
finding themselves, oh, I'd much rather just be home than go out on a Friday night,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
mm,
Um, and then wondering why I used to love going out, you know?
Mhm.
Or even in the business world, networking. That's another area that has changed. And people who are really
mhm,
outgoing, who loved that networking, now don't have the opportunity in the same way, right? They might find themselves being testy or irritable. Oh, it's because I don't have my people connection like I used to.
Mhm. And I love that you use the word irritable, because I think when people connect grief, they ultimately and only think of sadness.
Hmm.
They don't think of all those other emotions that can come with grief. And irritability is a big one.
Yeah,
Um, it's also a big noticeable trigger for burnout, too. But
right.
grief can also be um, the same or
Mhm.
similar to burnout in certain ways. But having irritability, I think, is one of those things that people don't realize. Like, I am still grieving somebody. That's why I'm so short with people. And that's why I'm so matter of fact. And that's not a normal connection people make. What are some other things that people experience grief wise that they misconnect that it's grief? What's something that can happen, or a reaction or a feeling that people aren't expecting?
Happiness, right? So here's an interesting one. Uh, a client of mine lost her 16-year-old daughter,
Mm,
and she knew that it was happening. Her daughter had a genetic issue that was there from birth. Um, and she found herself laughing a lot, the opposite of
mm,
what we'd expect.
mhm,
She realized that she was in deep gratitude for what she got to have with her daughter. They didn't
mm,
expect her
mm,
to live past 2 or 3 years, and she
mm,
had her for 16. That's
mhm.
an unusual one,
Yeah.
right? But
mhm,
what are some of the others? Um, being tired, even if we think we're sleeping through the night, we aren't sleeping the same as we were before. It's not
Mm,
unusual to just be exhausted and not be able to get your energy back.
mhm.
mm,
Mhm. Um,
Yeah, and some people would think that they need to either sleep more or um, take naps or push their way through it, instead of realizing that they may need some counseling or
mhm,
they may need
mm,
some extra support group, because it
mhm.
is a form of grief and not just a tired, I'm tired. It's no, there's something else that's preventing your brain from giving you that energy.
Right.
mm,
And there's nothing wrong with asking for help.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How about something like anger?
Oh, yeah.
mm,
Anger for sure. Um, and outbursts of anger. If you haven't
Hmm.
identified it, if you've stuffed it, that something tiny. Gosh, I remember, it's embarrassing, but I remember at a McDonald's or Burger King, I don't remember which, somehow my $10.97 purchase turned into $1,097.
Oh my goodness.
I flipped out at the guy, like,
oh,
really flipped out. He just made a simple mistake, right? It
Right.
wasn't
Hmm.
simple to my bank account, but I really lost it, and I afterwards, I was like, "What on earth just came
Hmm.
over you?" Oh, yeah,
mm,
right? Yeah, I am still angry at that.
Hmm.
Um,
mm, mm,
and being aware too of the other pieces that come into your loss.
Hmm.
I wasn't angry that my brother died. at that moment, I realized I was angry at outside pieces of that whole event,
Mhm.
right? So, what else besides just the loss? What else changed in your life?
Mhm.
What else
Right.
impacted you?
Yeah.
Mm.
Losing a matriarch or a patriarch of a family that held all of the Christmas dinners
Oh,
or
yeah.
Thanksgiving dinners were at their house. That's a huge deal then the next year, the loss of a whole family getting together. And
Yeah.
I mean, I lost a grandparent, and I know I'll probably never see some of the cousins that I saw at that
Mhm.
Mm.
funeral, and that it's just never going to cross paths anymore. Never say never, but very slim chance.
And
Mhm.
And
that's a loss in itself.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah, other
Mhm.
relationships have changed. Even for, with Kristen's sister, if she lost her fiance, those in-laws may have disappeared as well from their life. I don't know the situation, but then you lose more relationships because
Right.
that person was that connection
Yep.
to other people, that bridge.
Mhm. And then what do you do about the lost traditions?
Right.
Right? You
Mhm.
mentioned Christmas and Thanksgiving. Oh boy,
Mhm.
the matriarch is gone. We're not getting together as a family for
Yeah.
Christmas anymore.
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
do I do?
We had that experience at my wedding, in November, so I just got married last November, and a lot of those thank you. A lot of those cousins that were there, it was really interesting. We were sitting outside before the ceremony saying, "When was the last time all of us were together?" And it was 5 years ago at our Nana's funeral. And
Mhm.
just there was not a giant gathering of all of us, and in the same moment, we all realized, we go, "Was that really the last time that this group of cousins gathered?" And we were like, let's not let this happen, friends. Like, we are all so close geographically, it would be so silly for us to just squander opportunities to maintain that connection. But it's
Yeah.
so wild how
Mhm.
one person, and in this family it was this tiny little lady, that kept us all together for those certain things like Christmas and holidays. And
Mhm.
it's just, we don't realize sometimes the impact that one person can have on a group of people
Mhm.
until
Mhm.
that impact is no longer there.
Right.
Mhm.
Um, it's wild.
It
We
is. It is.
I wonder a lot what we don't know in the moment. It's like, what am I not seeing right now that in 5 years or so I'm going to miss, or I'm gonna look back and say, "I was stressed about that." Why? It was this
Right.
big when it comes to the bigger picture of life. I'm thinking now too about, I'm sure you've had experiences with young parents, grandparents, like all ages, right? Do you notice a difference in the way that different generations process and communicate? Is it something that, because I know we think, and Mandy and my generation, we think that all of our parents didn't really talk about anything. Everything was just kind of swept under the rug. And are
Mhm.
you seeing those, or is it just from our experience because it's our parents that we think that?
No, that's definitely that very true that it was swept
Mm.
under the rug. A lot of stuff was swept under the
Mm.
rug, but when we come to death and um, grief, it's interesting. This 96-year-old woman, I met her a little over a year ago because she was terrified to die.
Mm.
Absolutely terrified. She couldn't even talk about it when we first met.
Mhm.
And what happened when she was, I think she said she was 6, her dad died suddenly,
Mm.
and, um, it was at a time when the body was often in the home, the wake was in the home and such, but it was
Mhm.
all hidden from her, all
Mm.
kept
Mm.
from her. Um, Someone told her mother, "Don't let her go to the funeral."
Mhm.
So, what we know about kids much more now is that that unknown is more terrifying, more
Mhm.
fearful because imaginations fill
Sure.
in the
Yeah.
blanks.
Right.
And I would say it took probably a good 9 or 10 months before we got to the place where she could begin to feel that she'd be able to handle death,
Mhm.
Mm.
right? So, and that's the sweeping it under the rug. So I
Mhm.
always tell parents now, let your kids be part of it. Don't
Mhm.
hide it. Answer the questions as best you can, and it's okay to say, "I don't know the answer to that."
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, there are a lot of things about death and grief that we don't have answers to because we're all different.
Mhm,
We have different backgrounds, we have different experiences, we have different cultures, we have different, even within the US, just having different regions. Um,
mhm.
and just like there's not, let me put it this way, there's not many people that have died and come back. So a lot of people die and you don't know what happens. You really don't know.
Yeah,
And you just see this, people are stepping into both worlds through the dying process. And I know seeing that working in hospice, when you see them one foot in, one foot out, it's a very surreal experience.
yeah.
And it's very wild to watch. It's just, what is actually happening, and there are just, people just don't know, they don't know. And
Right?
I've heard before that somebody told me, they said the two biggest wonders of this world that doctors and scientists and researchers just cannot figure out is the dying process and the birth process. And it's just so interesting that both of those are so similar
Mhm.
and yet so extremely different. But
Yes.
the process that one goes through, they're not ever the same for any person. No babies are born the same time, length,
Mhm.
everything.
Right.
There's no person that dies the same length, way. Everything is always slightly different.
Yeah,
And it's just
that is so
fascinating.
true. It is
Mhm.
fascinating. I'm
Yeah.
super fascinated by it.
Mhm.
So I just thought of one thing that might be helpful for folks too in thinking about kids and how do we support them at a time of loss of any sort.
Mhm.
My kids were 7, 6, and 5, 7, 5, somewhere right around there when my mom died. And I raised my kids in a 3-generation home. So they were
Mhm.
very, very close to their grandmom.
Mhm.
She was diagnosed with cancer, and I was working as a church secretary, and the pastor, someone in the church died. And he said, "Bring the kids to the wake." I'm like, "What?" He said, "Bring the kids to the wake." I said, "Why would I do that?" And I think
Mhm.
it was some of the best advice I ever got, and my kids
Mhm.
will talk about it now. He said, "Because it's not someone that they are emotionally connected to."
Sure.
They
Yeah.
know the guy's name was Glenn. They know Glenn as someone in the church,
Mhm.
so bring them
Mhm.
and make it
Mhm.
normal, normalize it.
Huge.
Right.
So we did,
Yeah.
we went to Glenn's and a few other people. We went to calling hours and
Mhm.
people thought I was kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Kids will say now how thankful they are that I
Mhm.
did
Mhm.
that because
Mhm.
they'll go to someone else they know. They'll
Mhm.
go to their family member's wake and
Sure.
be
Mhm.
able to be a support without being uncomfortable or afraid.
Mhm.
Absolutely. No, that's a great idea, especially again for young kids. I think normalizing things in a way early enough that the kids can't really remember when they were told a certain thing or when something became normalized is huge because then you just grow up with it as a reality.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Mhm.
yeah.
Mhm.
And it did
Yeah.
make when my mom died, it made it much easier for them. It
Mhm.
wasn't scary anymore.
Wasn't their first funeral experience
Mhm.
at such a young age, and
Yeah.
yeah, and it is something too. I know even with the loss that I've had in my life, people would say, "Why would you take her to a funeral? I have a 6-year-old, and why would you take her? Don't take her. If there's a body, don't take her." And it's just, it is something very taboo in our culture, the way that we are
Mhm.
here, that you don't talk about it and you don't want to scare them and you don't want to show them a dead body and you don't want them. But on the other side that I'm processing through now with my daughter, who's grieving a couple people, I lost a grandparent during COVID and we weren't allowed to have a funeral. So that person literally disappeared in her life
Right.
and she has no concept of where they went and what happened. She never said goodbye. It was just, they were there one day and they were not there the next. And that's happened to her multiple times. And it's like, she has this fear now of like, if I'm going to wake up, someone's just not going to be here.
Right.
And,
Mhm.
so you have to process through grief with kids, which is totally different than grief with adults. But just knowing that when you do hide things from the kids or not tell them something, then it makes it worse for them in the long run. And I've seen that firsthand experience in my life. And I've seen that firsthand in other people, like watching other people go through it, where they keep a diagnosis from a kid, or they don't
Mm,
tell them that a parent is sick, or they don't tell them that grandma has cancer or whatever that may be. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, grandma's dying. And the kid had no time to process. They had no chance to even talk or ask questions because everything was kept for their protection. And that is understandable because you don't want, like you said in the beginning of the conversation, you want to protect those that you love. And so you want to
mhm,
keep that from them.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to process things. And I know, I've heard women that have had miscarriages and they don't want to tell their kids that. And they keep that, but then they're grieving and they become irritable or angry, and their kids have no idea why. They don't get it. They're not seeing the full circle picture of everything.
And
Um,
kids are
and
pretty darn smart.
oh
they
yeah.
are
They
very
know
smart.
when something's gone awry.
Right.
Mhm,
Absolutely. Yeah. And so to have that knowledge that death is a part of life.
Mhm.
Everybody is going to die.
Right.
And it's just this big fear that people have. It's this scary journey. They don't want it to hurt. They don't want to, live with no brain capacity anymore, like in a vegetative state or something like that. People
mhm,
have these fears that they may not talk about on a regular basis, but that they're there.
Yep.
And when they then are faced head on with it, because inevitably in your life, you will know somebody who dies, you will walk through death with somebody, and you will walk as a caregiver or a support person to somebody, whether that's a spouse or a best friend or a parent or a child who loses someone close. And not
mhm,
having the tools in your toolbox on how to process grief and what is normal, like you're saying, things that are normal, like it's okay to be happy, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be tired. And without any of that knowledge and any of that preparation, when that time comes that you walk through that season, you just get smacked into the wall of reality
Right.
with
Right.
with nothing. We prepare ourselves on first aid training or CPR training, or we prepare ourselves. We like practice learning how to cook, and we
mhm,
learn how to do all these things, but nobody really learns how to
mhm,
grieve
Right.
and processes through it.
And if you're not prepared ahead of time, or you don't understand what grief is and that all of it is normal, we beat ourselves up,
mhm,
right?
Yeah,
mhm,
absolutely.
Why am I whatever, fill in the blank? There must
Right.
be something wrong with me. I must be a
Absolutely.
bad
Yeah.
person. And then you're just
Mhm.
layering on more
Yeah.
difficulty.
Yep. Complex, making it more complicated. And even just saying that, a lot of people, because they don't prepare for it or they don't really know much about it, they equate it to movies. So the same thing, like
mhm,
with somebody that's going to have a baby or going to have a wedding, or
Yeah.
once they're happily ever after fairy tale of marriage, they're always thinking about what were they shown, what princess movies have they seen,
Right?
um,
Yes.
what hospital scene have they seen in a movie or a show. Same thing with death. Like, when have you've seen like war movies or something? It's like that's what
mhm,
you're picturing death to be, as this
Right?
big traumatic event. In some ways, it can be a very beautiful event for a lot of people. And
mhm,
having that lack of knowledge and that preparation, then, like you're saying, you then think that there's something wrong with you when you're
Mhm.
happy, or
Mhm.
you think there's something wrong with you when you're angry all of a sudden.
Yep.
Um, and there's not. It's just part of the process.
Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
So how do we prepare?
Hmm.
Right? Um, I tell people, are you, either of you familiar with the Five Wishes?
Hmm.
It's a really
mm,
neat document. It's a legal document. So when people think about planning
Mm.
for end of life,
I do.
I
Yeah.
have a
I know.
will,
Yeah. Mhm.
things like that, the obvious ones. But the Five Wishes talks about much more. What do you want spiritually? What do you want
Mhm.
your family to know? Um, Lots of questions. So how do we begin these conversations? There
Mhm.
are fun ways. Fun. Death and fun, right?
Mhm.
Death over dinner is something I do. And let's all gather together and talk about death. So you do it at a time when it's not staring you in the face as something
Mhm.
deep and profound and personal, but ahead of
Mhm.
time and
Right.
making it a fun conversation
Mhm.
Yeah.
because it can be fun. Right? You
Mhm.
can think about, oh, what would you do in this situation? And that helps us
Mhm.
start internalizing it, start thinking about what would we want or not want,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Absolutely. And normalize it that,
Normalize
Mhm.
it.
for even for me, like I grew up with my dad maintained a cemetery, still does, just like maintains the grounds and is oversees it. And so the cemetery for me was always a comforting place. It was never a
Yeah.
scary place, but I couldn't tell you the first time my parents told me what to do when they die. Like they have given me instructions on their ashes from cremation 20 years ago, probably at this point, and I just know, and I've always known it. And it's like, it's going to be a hard day. It's going to be sad. It's going to be really emotional, but it's not something that I'm going to have to wonder and ask questions about. And
Yeah.
I always think, so my ex-husband was military and he before he deployed overseas, the military made him fill out this paper, and it was every detail of a funeral, that every
Mhm.
detail down to the scripture that he wanted read, to who he wanted to carry his casket, like every single
Yes.
detail of a funeral he had to prepare for. And he was 22 at this time. And that was such a weird thing at a young age, 23, whatever it was. And you're planning your funeral, but you're going
Mhm.
into a war zone, obviously knowing that this is a possibility. And so I remember filling that out with him and writing down the names of the 6 people that he wanted to carry his casket, and he wanted this person to give the eulogy, and he wanted this read, and it was like so surreal.
Yeah.
But the military did that with the intention, knowing that if this happens, you're not going to be in a state of mind to be able to prepare this service.
When
Mhm.
I've
So
when
yeah.
I've officiated funerals for people who have planned their funeral ahead of time, I can't tell you how always, every single time, I am so glad they did this. What a
Mhm.
gift they gave us to not have to figure this out.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
not have a reason for the family to have tension and not have a reason for the family to
Ooh.
argue because it's on the paper. It's
Yep.
what they want. It's right here. Yeah.
Exactly. Down to the flower colors, down to
Mhm.
whether or not they want taps played if they're military, down to whether or not
Mhm.
they want an organist or a guitar player, down to all of that makes it such a lighter load for the family to carry.
Mhm.
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 So, but again, a very weird concept, a very like not something people want to talk about, especially at our age in our 30s now. We're like, we don't want to talk about what our funeral is going to look like. But
Mhm.
you just never know. You literally never know when it's your time
Never.
and when your day is going to
Mhm.
that's it.
Yep.
And what do you do? Maybe at 30, maybe you don't need to have every detail. Maybe that's a little too far, without
But
like some
maybe
kind of
not,
diagnosis, but maybe not.
right?
And maybe it's
Mhm.
comforting and it's just tucked away
Yeah.
or just told in a way that's I've always just told people like I never want to be buried and like full body. Like I want to be cremated. And I've told that to many
Mhm.
people. And I've made sure to tell people outside my family, like if something happens to me, please do not let my family bury my body. Like and
Yep.
and it's like here it is right here on a recording. We're recording a podcast. It is now recorded. Please
There
do not
it is.
bury my body. And so it's like it's just something that I've said. Like it's just
Yeah.
that's just the way that it is. And when you have those wishes or those things that you want and you want to prepare that ahead of time, it alleviates so much pressure when a family member or a, a close friend is in a state of shock and needing to make financial decisions, needing to
Mhm.
make
Right.
preparation decisions, ceremonial decisions. All of that is very overwhelming for somebody who's grieving.
Yeah. Yep. And not all those not only all those details about your funeral, but what about before you die,
Hmm.
right?
Sure.
So part of the 5 wishes workshop that I do, I share the example of my 5 wishes, which says, "Do not have me in a hospital bed in my bedroom with all the shades drawn and everything all quiet. I want people around me. I want the shades open. I want the fresh air flowing through."
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I love touch. I'm a huggy kind of person. I'm a put my hand on your shoulder if you're having a hard time kind of person. My 5 wishes says, "Do not rub your hand on my back or anywhere. Don't
Mm,
rub." Because to me, that's like nails on a chalkboard,
Mm.
mm,
right?
Mhm.
How am I gonna be able to tell someone that if I'm nearing the end of life and I'm not alert and conscious?
Sure.
mhm,
Here's
Yeah.
someone rubbing my skin, and it's you know what it's like to hear the nails on the chalkboard, right?
Mhm.
mhm.
What other things
That's
can you
interesting because
think
that's
about ahead of time?
perceived, yeah, as such a comforting thing, and you're like, "Mm-mm, nope, opposite
Mhm.
reaction to that."
Yeah, yep,
That's huge. So 5 wishes, I'm gonna make sure that I take a look at that because that's really I think, Mandy, going back to what you say about your parents sharing what they want, that doesn't surprise me at all about knowing their personalities. I'm not shocked that it probably came up while you were doing dishes one day,
Yeah.
but, being able to bring this up to people who might not have, well, first of all, might be uncomfortable with the conversation and say, "Well, let's just open the conversation with this very specific, quick little," just planting the seed, and then that might open the door for more conversations to bloom.
yeah.
Mhm.
There are plenty of people who don't even like, my mom has also mentioned, she goes, "Oh, it would be so nice to have my ashes." I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, it was random out of the blue, and to be able to cultivate that conversation in a more productive way and say, "Well, I know you mentioned this one time, but really, how can I honor you best
Mhm.
while you're still here and then after you're gone?" And I can imagine there would be such a beautiful respect in that conversation as well, because
Mhm.
they are being asked
Mhm.
while they are still here.
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
even way before they might have to leave this earth. So
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
And
so thank you for sharing that resource too.
it absolutely helps families too when siblings, let's say mom gets cremated, which sibling keeps mom, or does mom get buried? Like,
Right?
and
Mm,
it's a very tense conversation when people say my relationship was better with her. No, mine was. No, mine was. No, mine was. And then you add in all this versus just having a sealed document that's opened and it's got everything laid out there for you
mhm,
of what you wanted.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, again, same thing, like the living will is something I think a lot of people don't know about, that you can have a living will, like, please do not leave me on life support, please donate my organs, things like that, that
mhm,
Yeah.
are options that you can give when you aren't in a state to make your own decisions, but that you are able to make them and you can write them down, and somebody needs to abide by what those wishes are.
And
Um,
think about them. I
mhm,
tell people, think about all this when you're young. I've tried to get my kids to do their 5 wishes. I have
mhm,
since they were teenagers
mm,
because you never know, right?
right.
mhm,
What if you're in a traumatic car accident tomorrow and you're being rushed into the ER? Do you wanna be trying to make these decisions then?
Right.
Either for
mm,
yourself or for someone you love?
Mhm.
mhm. Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, and they happen immediately. These decisions are not something you can sit on and think about for a week.
Not if you
And
wait
even
till
a
the last
funeral,
minute.
it's like when somebody dies, you go to the funeral home the next day. It's not a whole lot
Mhm,
of wait
Yeah.
time. Um, and so having that prepared ahead of time can be very helpful, like you're saying, to have
mhm,
that. And I think it's so important to remind ourselves that you can change them. Like,
Yeah.
you can put your 5 wishes
mm,
down at 30 years old, and then when you're 40, you can go and do it again and just throw away the one from when you're 30 because it's going to look different. You may have more kids, you may have a house, you may have this, whatever.
Yep.
Like, change them, update them. Sure.
Yep.
You
mhm,
update your address when you move, you update your credit cards on your automatic transaction bill payments when you get a new credit card. Like,
Yep.
just do the
mhm,
same thing with your wishes and your requests as
Mhm.
well. So,
mhm,
all good things to keep in mind, and all
Yeah.
important things that people don't think about and don't want to talk about. And
Mhm.
even people that are comfortable with death in a way are still uncomfortable with death. There's nothing really fully comfortable
Yeah.
with
mhm,
somebody dying. And
Yeah.
um, I think even with your experience, Lee, that you've had, there's still always an element of wonder. Um,
Mhm.
and same for me, that it's just, wow, that's just fascinating. And there's something intriguing about it.
mhm,
Yep.
So,
mm. I'm gonna lead our last question with a little bit of a story, just because I think it's interesting to think about. But I was asked to provide just like graveside hymns on guitar at my grandpa's, or it wasn't his internment; it was basically another funeral. He also passed during COVID, and so we did a funeral after a funeral that more people could come to.
Yeah.
But I was shocked because one of my aunts asked me to sing "Joy to the World." After we had done and we were about to leave, she goes, no, you have to sing "Joy to the World." I go, I'm wondering, why do you feel like this would be appropriate right now? Because it's a very happy, joyous song. And apparently that was one of the very few songs that Grandpa would sing in church.
Oh.
And it only comes around once a year.
Yep.
So it was fascinating to me that that's what she wanted to hear, and that's what they wanted. And that's what some of the siblings were happy with it. Some of them weren't, but some of the siblings sang "Joy to the World" at graveside, with Grandpa. And it seemed to me to be juxtaposed against the sadness of his wife crying and his children joyously singing. It was so fascinating to me. But that's leading into my question for you is, there are so many songs that can be healing and that can transport us to a certain time. And your experience with heavy emotions, I'm sure, has such an effect on your self-care and what you listen to, and just so many factors. And so I'm curious, Lee, is there a song that would help our listeners to get to know Lee better in any way that we can add to our playlist?
Yeah. It's a hymn called "In the Bulb There Is a Flower."
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about the cycle of life and death and rebirth and all that. Spring flowers, right? Coming from bulbs. We sang that. My daughter sang it for my grandfather's funeral. She was 12, 13, I don't remember. And I put the service together and led it and asked her if she would sing that. And sure. We're on our way back home from the funeral, and 3.5 hours away. My 3 kids in the back seat, all of a sudden she pipes up and says, "Mom, you need to sing this song at your ordination." What? This is a funeral song. You want it at my ordination? I didn't say that. She said, "Oh, tell me more." And she went through this whole thing about, well, when you were a little girl and your family, because I was the baby of the family, and they thought that you were, you just had to be little and all that. And when your mom told you could only be a secretary, well, that's all when you were a bulb. But then you met Pastor Weber, and he told you could be and do anything. And that's when you started to break through. And she went through this whole thing, all the different stages. And she said, and when the flower bursts forth, that's when you're ordained. And so you gotta sing that. So that's the one.
Kids say the darndest things, man.
Oh,
that's amazing.
Don't they? And now whenever it's sung, if she's with me and we're in church for any reason, she's always looking at me. Is she going to cry? Is she going to? But I love it for a lot of reasons.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm not familiar with that one. Are you familiar with that one, Mandy?
I don't know if I am. I'm going to have to listen to it. I might recognize it. Some of those hymns can sound the same, but they can also have their own. So I'll have to look it up.
Yeah. I'm not going to try and sing it for you because I don't sing well.
It's okay. We'll add that to our Spotify playlist so our listeners can hear your song choice and what you connect to this episode. So we're just really grateful for your knowledge and experience, and just the peace that you bring in your conversations, and that your demeanor is just so comforting for a lot of people, I think, and it only makes sense that it led you into hospice care and work. So thank you for hanging out with us today and just having a great conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.